In 1953, American spies destroyed a democracy for oil, not war, not communism, not terror. Just £100 million a year. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how they did it. You'll see the memos, the money, and the man who paid the price. A foreign company drilled Iran's oil and kept almost all the profit. One prime minister said no. His name was Mohammad Mosaddegh. He nationalized the oil. Britain called it theft. Iran called it justice. London couldn't invade, so it asked Washington to do it quietly instead. The CIA gave the operation a name, TPAJAX, Operation Ajax. $1 million bought fake mobs, bribed newspapers, and rented soldiers. The first coup attempt failed completely. The plotters were caught. Headquarters ordered the mission scrapped. One CIA officer ignored the order. 4 days later, tanks rolled toward the Prime Minister's own house. For 60 years, the United States denied any of this happened. Then in 2013, the CIA quietly admitted the whole operation was real. This wasn't just about Iran. It became history's regime change blueprint. Guatemala, Chile, and Iraq all borrowed pages from this exact playbook. A quiet economist in pajamas terrified two empires at once. His only weapon was a signature on a nationalization law. What happened next reshaped the Middle East for 70 years. It planted the seed for a revolution 26 years later. It poisoned U.S.-Iran relations into the 21st century. And almost none of it was taught in a single history class. This story starts with an oil concession signed in 1901. It ends with declassified CIA cables admitting to sabotage. In between, assassination blockades, fake riots, and a stolen democracy. Every fact here comes from declassified government files, not speculation. Stay until the end for the detail the CIA tried hardest to hide. This is the real story of the first oil coup in history. Let's go back to a muddy island called Abadan in 1908. In 1901, a British investor bought Persia's oil rights for almost nothing. His name was William Knox Darcy, and he'd never even visited Iran. For 7 years, his crews drilled and found absolutely nothing valuable. Darcy nearly went bankrupt chasing oil that refused to appear. Then in May 1908, drillers finally struck oil in commercial quantities. Within a year, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born in London. The concession covered most of southern Iran for 60 full years. Iranians received a small royalty. Britain received almost everything else. By 1913, Winston Churchill made a decision that changed everything. He converted the British Navy from coal power to oil power. Suddenly, Persian oil wasn't just profitable, it was a strategic weapon. The British government quietly bought a controlling stake in the company. Iran's oil was now fueling an empire it barely profited from. Abadan refinery grew into the largest oil refinery on earth. Workers there lived in mud huts without clean water or electricity. British staff lived in air-conditioned housing with swimming pools nearby. The wage gap wasn't an accident. It was the entire business model. By 1933, Iran demanded a fairer deal and higher royalties. Britain agreed to a new concession, but extended it 32 more years. Iranians got a marginal raise. The company kept almost everything else. Crucially, the company refused to ever open its accounting books. No Iranian official could verify how much oil money was real. By 1949, annual company profits topped £100 million. Iran's actual share was a small fraction of that enormous sum. The company itself paid more in British taxes than Iranian royalties. Let that sink in. London taxed the oil more than Iran did. Iranian workers noticed. Iranian politicians noticed. Anger began building for years. In 1946, a wave of strikes shut down parts of Abadan. British troops and gunboats were sent to intimidate the strikers. Nationalist politicians began demanding something radical: full nationalization of oil. One of the loudest voices belonged to a lawyer named Mosaddegh. He'd studied law in Europe and hated foreign economic control. He believed Iran's resources should finally serve Iranian citizens first. In 1949, he formed a coalition called the National Front. Their single unifying demand: nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company completely. In March 1951, Iran's own prime minister was assassinated by a hardliner. The killer belonged to a group demanding oil nationalization immediately. Parliament, shaken and emboldened, voted to nationalize the oil industry. Weeks later, Mohammad Mosaddegh became Iran's new prime minister. He hadn't just joined the movement. He now led the entire country. On May 1, 1951, the Shah signed the nationalization into law. For the first time, Iran legally owned its own oil fields. Britain called it an act of theft against a legitimate contract. Iran called it the end of 50 years of quiet colonization. The National Iranian Oil Company was created to replace the British firm. British engineers and executives were told their contracts no longer existed. London was furious, humiliated, and terrified of a dangerous precedent. If Iran got away with this, so might Egypt, Iraq, or India. Britain decided this fight was bigger than one refinery in Abadan. What came next wasn't diplomacy. It was economic warfare in disguise. Mosaddegh believed the world couldn't survive without Iranian oil for long. His advisors told him Western economies would eventually beg for a deal. That assumption turned out to be dangerously, catastrophically wrong. Britain immediately pulled every single skilled technician out of Abadan. Without British engineers, the world's largest refinery ground to a halt. Britain then convinced global oil companies to boycott Iranian crude entirely. Tankers simply stopped docking at Iranian ports almost overnight. The Royal Navy sent warships to patrol the waters near Abadan. Officially, this was a show of force. Unofficially, it was a blockade. Iran's oil sat underground, worthless, because nobody would legally buy it. Oil revenue, once the backbone of Iran's economy, collapsed almost to zero. Unemployment surged as the industry that fed thousands simply stopped working. Britain took its case to the International Court of Justice in 1952. The court ruled it had no jurisdiction over Iran's internal law. It was a stunning legal victory for Mossadegh's nationalization campaign. Britain refused to accept defeat and quietly began exploring other options. Winston Churchill, back in power, wanted Mossadegh removed by any means. British intelligence, MI6, began drafting early plans for a coup. They needed American help because Britain alone lacked the reach anymore. The United States, under President Truman, initially refused to get involved. Truman's administration saw this as a colonial dispute, not a Cold War threat. Everything changed in November 1952 when Eisenhower won the presidency. Eisenhower's new administration viewed the world through a stricter anti-communist lens. British diplomats reframed the crisis, not oil greed, but Soviet danger. They warned that instability might let Iran's communist Tudeh party seize power. Internal CIA reports actually disagreed and called a communist takeover unlikely. That inconvenient analysis was quietly ignored by the incoming administration. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was firmly convinced by British pressure. His brother, Alan Dulles, happened to run the Central Intelligence Agency. Two brothers now controlled American diplomacy and American covert operations together. Meanwhile, Mossadegh's economic crisis at home was quietly getting worse. With no oil revenue, his government leaned on emergency powers to survive. He dissolved parts of parliament through a controversial national referendum. Critics called it authoritarian. Supporters called it a fight for survival. His political coalition, once united, began fracturing under enormous pressure. Communists, monarchists, and clergy all found new reasons to oppose him. Britain and the emerging American allies noticed this fracture immediately. A divided nation is far easier to destabilize than a united one. In early 1953, British and American intelligence officially began joint planning. The mission needed a name that sounded routine, not revolutionary. They chose TPAJAX, later shortened simply to Operation Ajax. Britain's parallel codename was far more theatrical, Operation Boot. The plan's core idea was deceptively simple and dangerously effective. Iran's Shah could legally dismiss a prime minister under the constitution. If the Shah signed the order, the coup would look completely legal. No tanks, no invasion, just royal paperwork and manufactured public pressure. The CIA needed a man on the ground to make that happen. They chose Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. He would become the architect of the first CIA regime change operation. What he built in Tehran would echo for the next 70 years. Kermit Roosevelt entered Iran secretly, using a false identity and cover story. His budget for destabilizing an entire government was roughly $1 million. That money didn't buy weapons. It bought influence, silence, and chaos. Bribes flowed to newspaper editors willing to print anti-Mossadegh propaganda daily. Cartoonists were paid to draw Mossadegh as weak, foolish, or insane. Clergy members received payments to denounce him from local pulpits. Street thugs were hired to pose as rival political factions entirely. Some protesters chanted pro-communist slogans while secretly funded by the CIA. The goal was making Mosaddegh look dangerously allied with the Soviets. Other paid crowds posed as furious religious citizens demanding his removal. Both mobs were often funded by the exact same covert budget. The chaos itself was the weapon, regardless of which side seemed to win. Military officers loyal to the Shah were secretly recruited and paid. General Fazlollah Zahidi was chosen as the replacement prime minister candidate. Roosevelt needed the Shah's signature to make removal look constitutional. The Shah, however, was nervous, indecisive, and terrified of failure. He worried Mosaddegh remained genuinely popular with everyday Iranian citizens. American officials reportedly pressured him relentlessly through secret late-night meetings. Eventually, the Shah signed 2 royal decrees dismissing the prime minister. One decree removed Mosaddegh. The other formally appointed General Zahidi. On August 15 and 16, 1953, the plan was finally launched. An officer arrived at Mossadegh's home to deliver the dismissal decree. Mosaddegh had already been warned, likely by sympathizers inside the military. He had the messenger arrested instead of stepping down quietly. The plot collapsed publicly within hours of its very first move. News of the failed coup spread quickly across Tehran's streets. The Shah panicked and fled the country almost immediately afterward. He flew first to Baghdad, then continued onward toward Rome. CIA headquarters in Washington believed the operation was now completely dead. A cable ordered Roosevelt to shut everything down and leave Iran. Roosevelt reportedly read the order and simply refused to obey it. He believed one more push could still salvage the entire mission. With CIA money still available, he restarted the propaganda machine immediately. Paid demonstrators flooded back into Tehran's central streets and squares. This time they claimed to support the Shah, not oppose him. Mosaddegh, trying to keep order, banned public demonstrations entirely. That single decision accidentally cleared the streets of his own supporters. Communist and pro-Mosaddegh crowds obeyed the ban and simply stayed home. Paid royalist crowds, funded by the CIA, ignored it completely. For the first time, the street belonged only to Mossadegh's opponents. On August 19, those crowds marched directly toward government buildings. Tanks loyal to General Zahidi joined the march through the capital. Fighting broke out near radio stations, military posts, and government offices. Reports estimate several hundred people were killed during that single day. By afternoon, tanks surrounded Mossadegh's private residence in the capital. After hours of shelling, Mosaddegh escaped briefly over a garden wall. He surrendered to authorities the very next morning, exhausted and defeated. The Shah, still in Rome, learned that the coup had somehow succeeded. He returned to Iran within days to reclaim his lost throne. Kermit Roosevelt had done what headquarters explicitly ordered him not to do. A democracy had fallen because one officer disobeyed a direct order. Mosaddegh was arrested and put on trial for treason against the Shah. He famously defended himself in court without hiring a single lawyer. He argued that defending national oil wasn't treason, but simple patriotism. The court sentenced him to 3 years in solitary military confinement. After his sentence ended, he wasn't freed, just relocated to house arrest. He spent the rest of his life quietly isolated on his estate. He died in 1967, still legally barred from public political life. His own government refused him a public funeral or state burial. The man who nationalized Iran's oil was buried in his own living room. Meanwhile, General Zahidi took power as Iran's new prime minister immediately. The Shah, no longer a figurehead, now ruled with far greater authority. Within a year, a new oil deal was quietly negotiated in secret. Nationalization technically remained on paper, but operations changed completely underneath it. A new international consortium was formed to run Iran's oil fields. British Petroleum, the renamed AIOC, kept a significant share of control. American oil companies, absent before the coup, now owned a major stake. Iran received improved profit terms but still no operational control whatsoever. The company that started this entire crisis lost its total monopoly. American oil firms, previously locked out, finally entered the Persian market. The company that started this entire crisis lost its total monopoly. American oil firms, previously locked out, finally entered the Persian market. Some historians argue that access was the coup's real, quiet objective. Britain protected its remaining stake. America gained an entirely new one. The Shah, propped up by Washington, ruled Iran for 26 more years. His government grew increasingly authoritarian, wealthy, and disconnected from ordinary citizens. He created a secret police force known as SAVAK to control dissent. Reports say American and Israeli intelligence helped train SAVAK's early operatives. Dissidents were monitored, arrested, and sometimes tortured for simply speaking out. Anger that once targeted the British Oil Company now targeted the Shah. Religious leaders, nationalists, and leftists all quietly built parallel opposition networks. For years, Washington publicly denied any involvement in the 1953 coup. Official statements described it as a purely internal Iranian political matter. Historians and journalists suspected CIA involvement for decades without confirmation. In 1954, one CIA officer wrote a private internal summary of events. That document, known as the Wilber report, remained classified for decades. It wasn't declassified, even partially, until the year 2000. Even then, key sections remained blacked out to protect sensitive sources. In 2013, the National Security Archive published a formal CIA acknowledgement. For the first time, an official document confirmed the agency's central role. In 2017, roughly 1,000 additional pages were finally released publicly. Those pages revealed the canceled order Roosevelt had quietly disobeyed. They also revealed just how close the entire operation came to failing. By 1979, decades of resentment finally reached an unstoppable breaking point. A revolution swept the Shah from power in a matter of months. He fled the country, much like he once fled during the coup. The revolution replaced a monarchy with an Islamic republic almost overnight. Militants later stormed the American embassy, citing the 1953 coup directly. 52 hostages were held for 444 days. That crisis still shapes American perception of Iran to this very day. Every year since, the coup resurfaces in Iranian political rhetoric constantly. For Iranians, it remains proof that democracy was stolen once already. For historians, it remains the founding case study in regime change. Operation Ajax wasn't just a single event. It became a permanent method. The CIA had proven regime change could succeed cheaply and quietly. $1 million was far less costly than an actual invasion. Within a year, the same agency tested the model again in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown after threatening American banana company interests. The pattern felt familiar: land reform, foreign company anger, sudden coup. Chile followed decades later when Salvador Allende nationalized copper mining companies. He was removed in 1973, following economic pressure and covert support. Iraq, Congo, and other nations saw similar covert operations over the years. Each time, official government statements denied involvement for years afterward. Each time, declassified documents eventually proved those denials were false. The blueprint from Tehran became a template repeated across 4 continents. Destabilize the economy first. Fund both sides of unrest. Wait patiently. Let local anger do the work foreign soldiers used to do directly. Iran's coup proved that oil, not ideology, often drove Cold War decisions. Communism was frequently the public justification, not the actual private motive. Access to resources repeatedly explained decisions that ideology alone couldn't. This matters because textbooks often frame the Cold War purely as ideology. The real story was often boardrooms, contracts, and resource control instead. Mossadegh's real crime wasn't communism. He was never even a communist. His actual crime was threatening a lucrative deal built on secrecy. Refusing to open a company's books shouldn't have triggered a coup. Yet that single demand for financial transparency helped topple a government. It shows how fragile early democracies were against organized foreign pressure. It shows how easily national security language can disguise economic interests. It shows how quickly allies can become enemies over a single resource. Britain and America, close partners, coordinated to remove an elected leader. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was inconveniently independent. The coup also revealed something uncomfortable about intelligence agency accountability. A single field officer ignored a direct shutdown order from headquarters. His disobedience succeeded, which meant it was quietly celebrated, not punished. That precedent suggested field agents could override formal chains of command. Decades later, similar concerns resurfaced around unauthorized covert actions elsewhere. Accountability structures existed on paper but weren't always followed in practice. For Iran specifically, the coup created deep, lasting institutional distrust. Every subsequent Iranian government viewed Western diplomacy through a suspicious lens. Nuclear negotiations decades later were shaped by memories of 1953. Diplomats on both sides often reference this history during tense talks. It wasn't ancient history to Iranians. It remained an active grievance. Meanwhile, most American classrooms taught almost nothing about this event. Cold War curricula focused heavily on Europe, Korea, and eventually Vietnam. The Middle East's covert operations received comparatively minimal educational attention. That gap helps explain why many Americans misunderstand Iranian mistrust today. Understanding 1953 explains reactions that otherwise seem confusing or extreme. It reframes decades of tension as consequence, not simply irrational hostility. History rarely offers clean villains or perfectly innocent victims in these stories. Mosaddegh made mistakes. His coalition fractured. His economy genuinely struggled. But none of that justified erasing an elected government by force. The declassified files removed any remaining doubt about who was responsible. What remains is a lesson about power, secrecy, and unintended consequences. Modern oil-producing nations still study 1953 before negotiating foreign contracts. Nationalization efforts in Venezuela, Libya, and Nigeria echoed Iran's early example. Each new nationalization sparked fears of foreign retaliation informed by history. Some governments moved slowly, remembering exactly what happened to Mosaddegh. Others moved fast, betting foreign powers wouldn't risk repeating 1953 publicly. International law around resource sovereignty evolved partly because of this case. The idea that nations control their own natural resources gained global support. The United Nations later adopted resolutions affirming permanent sovereignty over resources. Iran's failed nationalization ironically helped establish rules protecting future nationalizations. Short-term, Mosaddegh lost everything. Long-term, his argument mostly won globally. By the 1970s, most oil-producing nations successfully nationalized their own industries. OPEC's rise in later decades built directly on principles Mosaddegh championed. Countries realized coordinated resource control was harder to overthrow than one nation. Strength in numbers became the lesson learned from Iran's earlier isolation. The CIA's own internal culture also changed because of this operation's success. Ajax became a template studied inside training programs for new officers. Later operations borrowed its media manipulation and paid protest strategies directly. Congressional oversight of covert operations increased significantly after later scandals emerged. The 1970s Church Committee investigated CIA abuses, including older Cold War operations. Public trust in intelligence agencies dropped sharply once details became known. Freedom of Information Act requests slowly forced open more historical secrets. Each newly declassified document reshaped public understanding of Cold War history. Historians continue debating exactly how much economic power motivated planners. Some argue oil access was the primary goal disguised as anti-communism. Others argue genuine Cold War fear played a larger role than assumed. Declassified memos actually support both interpretations, depending on which document you read. What's undisputed is the outcome, a democracy replaced by an autocrat. What's undisputed is the funding, the fake protests, and the disobeyed order. What's undisputed is the CIA's own eventual formal admission of guilt. Government secrecy delayed justice, but it didn't erase the historical record. Archivists, journalists, and researchers spent decades assembling the full picture. Malcolm Byrne and the National Security Archive played a central role. Their persistent legal requests eventually forced these documents into public view. Without their work, this story might have remained buried indefinitely. That's a reminder that historical truth often requires relentless institutional pressure. Governments rarely volunteer uncomfortable truths without sustained external demand for them. The Wilber report alone took nearly 50 years to reach the public. 50 years is roughly 2 full generations kept from an honest history. Students, diplomats, and voters all operated without this critical context. Foreign policy decisions were made without public understanding of past mistakes. Repeating patterns became easier when the original pattern stayed hidden. Transparency, however delayed, remains the only real check on covert power. Iran's 1953 coup teaches that secrecy protects institutions, not necessarily citizens. It teaches that economic interests can masquerade convincingly as national security. It teaches that one disobedient officer can alter an entire nation's future. It teaches that history, however buried, eventually resurfaces in some form. The coup that toppled Mosaddegh also toppled easy trust and official denials. Every redacted document since has been measured against this exact precedent. Every internal matter claim gets more scrutiny because of what happened here. This single 1953 operation permanently changed how the public reads government secrecy. And that shift may be its most lasting legacy of all. So here's the full story in one uncomfortable, honest sentence. A democracy fell because a company refused to open its books. Mosaddegh didn't threaten the world. He threatened one company's profit margin. Britain called for help. Washington answered with money mobs and manipulation. One cancelled order was ignored, and history quietly changed course forever. The Shah returned to a throne he'd briefly abandoned in panic. Mosaddegh returned to isolation and later to an unmarked grave. For 60 years, official records called this an internal Iranian matter. Declassified files eventually confirmed exactly whose hands built the outcome. This wasn't fiction, speculation, or wartime propaganda from either side. These were real CIA cables, real budgets, and real named officers. The consequences reached far beyond one country's oil fields alone. Guatemala, Chile, and others inherited this exact same covert playbook. Iran's 1979 revolution carried this memory directly into modern politics. Even today's nuclear negotiations echo distrust planted back in 1953. History rarely offers innocent parties or perfectly justified villains, and this doesn't either. Mosaddegh made real mistakes governing during an unprecedented economic crisis. None of those mistakes justified erasing an elected government by force. The line between national security and corporate protection blurred completely here. That blur has repeated itself in conflicts long after Iran's coup. Recognizing that pattern is the first step toward questioning it responsibly. Secrecy delayed accountability, but declassification eventually restored the historical record. That record now belongs to anyone willing to actually read it. If this story surprised you, imagine how many others remain classified today. History textbooks rarely cover this. Now you understand exactly why it matters. If you want more real, declassified history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe if you want the next hidden operation uncovered in full detail. Drop a comment. Which covered-up operation should we investigate next? This channel exists to tell the stories governments preferred to keep sealed. Thanks for watching until the very last classified page. See you next time.